Hi everyone, welcome to this YouTube channel. Today we're gonna talk about whether solar would work during power outages or not. And the answer depends on the configuration of solar that you have installed. If you just have a solar panel and an inverter that connects to a grid, like this configuration, then it won't work during power outages. But if you have a battery with hybrid inverter, then in that case, it will work during power outages. So to simplify things, I've decided to go with these. For example, if you have just solar panel like this, no battery, then in that case, the electricity is first get used by your house and the remaining electricity gets back to the grid. But if you don't have grid supply, then in that case the inverter stop working, because if the inverter is still on while the grid is off, the electricity can flow back and electrocute someone who is working on the grid. So that's why these types of solar panel, they just turns off during power outages, and the solar only are not stable enough because the sun can vary, availability of the light can vary, and it's not stable enough to power a house, right? So there we need like some sort of battery to stabilize the energy coming from solar so that it can power a house during outages. So like I said, this configuration is quite simple and it can help reduce the amount of electricity that is coming through the power grid to the house, because it gets supplemented by the solar. But the disadvantage is during power outages, like I've explained, it just disconnects. Second configuration, let's consider a solar panel and then battery and inverter. So in this configuration, what happens is the house is connected to grid and the solar panel has battery as well. So what happens is during outages, the inverter would supply the entire house, right? But when the electricity is available, depending on the algorithm of the inverter and the configuration, it will charge the battery, and then excess electricity is supplied to the house. And if the house is consuming a lot of electricity, it will draw from the grid. But in case the grid goes down, then the inverter disconnects the grid and the house is supplied entirely from the battery. But in this type of configuration, because the inverter is supplying the entire house, it can get very expensive because the inverter size has to supply the entire house, right? So it can get quite expensive. So that is the disadvantage of this type of configuration. The important factor that you should remember here is the hybrid inverter. The hybrid inverter can run without supply from the grid, right? So it can, the hybrid inverter is called hybrid inverter because they can work while connecting to the grid, and they can even work without grid at all. They don't need grid um, to work. Let's move on to next type of configuration. So before we move to another configuration, so the configuration that I just showed you is this, which supply the whole house. But you know, in day-to-day normal life, you don't need to supply everything in your house, right? You just need during power outages or blackouts, you only need few things. You can choose to supply only essential elements in your house during power outages to run, right? So you can bring the cost down by doing that. So this is an example of that type of circuit in which the solar power can charge the battery, and then it can flow through the inverter when it is operating in grid connection mode. It can go back to the grid, and it can also supply the house, and excess would go back to the grid. And but if there is power outages, in that case, what happens is the inverter just disconnects the grid here, and then electricity gets supplied from battery to all the essential loads. This is better because it helps to reduce the price a bit, because we won't need as big battery as we would to supply the entire house, and the size of the inverter would be smaller as well, because we don't need to supply the entire house. We're just supplying few like lights and freeze, only the critical stuff that we need during blackout. I think this is the best configuration because you get best of both worlds. And then third configuration is like completely off-grid inverter, where you have a big battery and a charge controller, and then a solar panel, like a big solar panel, and the electricity gets from the solar charges battery if we have excess electricity. Otherwise it goes to the inverter and goes to the house. This system is expensive as well. It doesn't need grid, but this is very expensive. So the very practical and most common solar approach is this one, if we have to spend like a decent amount of money, and this one if you only want to replace your consumption but you don't really care about blackout. So this solar can operate during blackout, this can't, but this would be way cheaper than this because the inverter and the battery would cost a bit more for this configuration. So this is the summary table of what I just described. So the backup cost ultimately depend on your preference, whether you want, larger solar array, or, do you want longer backup runtime, depending on how much outages you get, and peace of mind as well. So yeah, all these affect your decisions. So thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you.